This is a video lecture of the skeletal system. This week we cover two major systems, the skeletal and the muscular system. And they do really intimately go together because our skeleton can only move with the help of muscles. So we will look at both of these systems and how they interact. So the skeletal system is made up of two different major tissues, both of which are connective tissue, and those two tissue types are bone and cartilage. So cartilage provides some cushion between our bones and provides a gliding surface for where bones attach to one another. We have articular cartilage found at joints, and we also find them near the ribs, where between the ribs and the sternum, those are the costal cartilages, and that's also the type of cartilage there is hyaline cartilage. And another term that you've probably been familiar with are ligaments. Ligaments connect bones to bones, and tendons connect muscle to bone. So ligaments connect bone to bone. So moving on then, when we look at functions of the skeletal system, it's support. All of our organs are supported in the different cavities by bone. And when they work with the muscular system, it allows for movement. The bone is most important for protection. When you think about our delicate brain tissue, that is all completely surrounded by bone in the cranial cavity, and the skull, the bones of the skull protect that very delicate brain. And the spinal cord as well is very delicate tissue. It's completely encased by bone, which are the vertebrae, and that keeps that spinal cord intact and less susceptible to damage and injury. It also produces blood cells. Our red and white blood cells that are circulating through our bloodstream were produced in the red bone marrow of our bones. As adults, the red bone marrow is found in the ends of our long bones, like those that form or that we see in the arm and leg, and also in the flat bones, such as the flat bones of the hip and of the cranium. So our red and white blood cells have a limited lifespan, some of them more limited than others, but regardless, they are produced in the marrow of our bones. So our bone marrow is very important for producing those and replacing red and white blood cells. And the bone itself stores calcium and phosphate. What makes our bone hard is the salt calcium phosphate. That's what gives it its hardness. And there's a little bit of collagen mixed in our bone. That's also a connective tissue, and that gives the bone some flexibility. So it's the calcium phosphate that makes our bones hard, and the collagen that makes them somewhat flexible and shock absorbing. And also fat in the shaft of our long bones is fat or yellow marrow. So in the inside cavity of our arm and leg bones, we find that yellow marrow, which is just adipose tissue or fat. So if we look at a typical long bone, we can see some important parts. I'm going to go to your textbook resources. They have a little nicer pictures here. So we're going to look at this first one here. This is figure 12.1. I can see things a little better. So if we look at a typical long bone, like what we might see in our arm and leg, a couple of different structural features you should be aware of. First of all, the enlarged ends of our long bones, that's called the epiphysis. So this particular long bone has two epiphyses. Here, this enlarged end, and this enlarged end. That's the epiphysis. And the long shaft of the bone, we call that the diaphysis. So epiphysis and diaphysis. If we look at the type of bone tissue found in a long bone, we'll see here in the epiphyses, it's spongy bone. So spongy bone is not solid bone. It has some air spaces in here that makes the bones a little lighter than they would be if they were solid bone. So this is called spongy bone. And if we cut this, and we would see this is the same down here, it's spongy bone. But in the shaft or in the diaphysis of the bone, it's solid bone. So we call the solid portion of bone compact bone. So that's what this is compact bone. It's solid bone, no air spaces. And then inside that is a hollow cavity, which we call the medullary cavity. And the medullary cavity contains some blood vessels, but most of this cavity is filled by yellow marrow, which is fat in adults. In children, we find red marrow in this medullary cavity, but as adults, it's filled with fat and it's yellow marrow. We find the red marrow in the air spaces here of the epiphyses. So the red marrow fills those spaces in the spongy bone of our epiphyses. We also see that there's an outer layer that covers bone. It's called the periosteum, so that's the outer layer of our bone. It contains living cells that work to increase the width of our bone and help to repair fractures if they should occur. So the periosteum is that outer covering on bone. Here's a blood vessel. Bone has a good blood supply, so if we break a bone, it's able to heal very quickly. If we don't go in to get it set and realigned properly, a person can have a crooked bone that has healed inappropriately. So it's always good to be seen if you think you have a broken bone because of that rich blood supply. So compact bone forms the diaphysis on the outside. It has a hollow medullary cavity filled with fat or yellow marrow, and the ends of our bones, called the epiphyses, has the spongy bone filled with red marrow for making red and white blood cells. And on the ends of our bones, on where they come in contact with other bones, we have this outer lining here called the articular cartilage, which is made up of hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage provides a nice slippery surface for those bones to rub against one another at joints to allow us to bend and move our skeleton. So moving back then to our PowerPoint or your notes page, we can see that if we look at compact bone, the cells that make compact bone are arranged in these circular units called osteons. So just in this outer edge here, we have all of this solid bone tissue with each little circular osteon, which is just circular layers of bone containing an artery, a vein, and a nerve. So again, a very rich blood supply on this outer edge of compact bone, and it can be painful if we break a bone because there are nerves that run down every little circular unit or osteon. So rich blood supply, good nerve supply. So if a person simply cannot move a bone or a limb, if they've been injured, that's often a sign of a break versus a sprain. Is it really, really, really hurts to move a broken bone versus a sprained muscle or ligament or tendon. So cartilage and bone make up the skeletal system. Cartilage is very flexible, so it allows for flexibility, but it's not as strong, so we can tear cartilage. And the cells that make cartilage in the body, we call them chondrocytes. So chondrocytes are simply cartilage cells. Their job is to make cartilage. But cartilage tissue in itself does not have a good nerve or blood supply. So as a result of that, it's very slow to heal. So when someone tears cartilage in their knee, for example, that can be a lifelong problem because there's no blood supply, there's no repairing cells to go in and repair that cartilage tear. And the good news is, though, because there's no nerves, cartilage injuries don't hurt as much. What does hurt is the connective tissues and the muscle injuries that are around that cartilage tear. So it's not the cartilage itself that hurts, it's the tissues and the muscles around it that can cause pain. So cartilage, there's 3 types of cartilage in the body. Hyaline is the most common cartilage found in the body. Then we have fibrocartilage, which is very tough. And what fibrocartilage is, where we find that is in the intervertebral discs of your spine. It allows flexibility and pressure between those vertebrae to be tolerated because of that tough fibrocartilage. And then we have elastic cartilage, and elastic cartilage is very more flexible than hyaline, and we find that, for example, in the ear, much more flexible type of cartilage there, where fibrocartilage is a tougher cartilage. We find it in the front, where the hips come together in the front to form the pubic symphysis, and again in the intervertebral discs. So there's just some, descriptions there of where we find that cartilage. And then we're going to look a little bit at the skeleton, but mostly we're looking at parts of the skeleton in the lab portion of the course. The lecture portion, we're just going to kind of talk about function. So in these PowerPoint slides where there's a lot of anatomy being shown, I'm going to refer you to the lab video to talk about or to learn about all the different bones and their names. So there's 206 bones in the skeleton. If those bones lie along the midline of the body, we refer to that as the axial part of the skeleton. So the axial skeleton is the skull, the hyoid bone, which is found just outside the cervical vertebrae, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. Those form the midline of the body, and everything is attached to that. So the axial is like the main frame, the main axis of the body. So we can see in this diagram here, what's shown in blue is the axial skeleton, and the other region of the skeleton is the appendicular skeleton, and that's what's shown in light brown here, or tan. That's everything that comes off of the axial skeleton. So we have the arms and the legs and the bones of the shoulder and the hip. Those are all part of the appendicular skeleton. So again, we'll go over the anatomy part in the lab video. So just a quick review. We remember that the bones of the skull protect the brain. That's their main function. And we have a couple of joints. We have what are called sutures here. These are non-movable joints, and they are separated a little bit in the newborn skull. So there's those little soft spots we feel in the newborn skull, especially at the top here between the frontal bone and the parietal bone, and here at the back between the occipital bone and the parietal bones. We see a little space there in newborns. Those are called fontanelles, or soft spots. So those will eventually grow together, but these bones are separate bones, and they come together at what we call sutures. So more bones of the skull that we'll learn about in the lab portion. The vertebral column has kind of a curved S shape, and if it's not curved appropriately, we call that scoliosis. So if it's curving to the left or right, that's scoliosis. If it curves inward, like when people have a more indented lumbar region, the lower back curves in more than it should, we call that we call that lordosis, or sway back. So when the lumbar region goes in a little bit too far, that's a lordosis. And if the thoracic region hunches outward, like the hunchback, we call that a kyphosis. So lordosis is not uncommon among young people, and kyphosis we see more among the elderly with osteoporosis. They tend to get small fractures of the vertebrae, and it gives them that hunchback appearance. And scoliosis, like we said, is a sideways curvature of the spine. So the vertebral column has nerves that exit, and that controls our muscles and organs. So if we have damage to the vertebrae, it can often pinch off nerves, causing dysfunction of the organs or the muscles that those nerves stimulate. So it's important that we have good adjustment and good alignment of the vertebrae. And the canal inside the vertebrae is where the spinal cord passes through. So you'll learn about the regions of the spine in the lab video. If we look at a typical vertebra, though, we can see the body is where all the weight of the upper body is found. So if we look at the lumbar vertebrae, the body is very large because there's a lot more weight on that lower vertebrae than there is, say, up near the neck. It's just the skull that sits on the vertebrae of the neck. So the body's much smaller. The body of the vertebrae are much smaller in the cervical region. We also have spinous processes where the muscles of the back, so we see really long spinous processes in the thoracic vertebrae because that's where the muscles of the back attach. And then again, we have these cartilage little discs between the vertebra. That's the intervertebral disc, and that allows for flexibility of the spine to allow us to twist and turn and bend. And as long as we have good alignment, those discs are healthy, but sometimes if we get poor alignment, it puts extra pressure on the disc and can cause the disc to bulge, or what we say herniate. To herniate means to swell and bulge, and that can put pressure on the nerves that exit between these, in these spaces here between the vertebrae, and that can cause nerve damage as well. So it's important for people to get their spine, in alignment, and to do the necessary procedures to prevent nerve damage if that should happen. So those intervertebral discs are composed of fibrocartilage, and it is a very tough cartilage that we find between the vertebra. And it's, again, gives us some shock absorbing ability for running, jumping, twisting, and allows for movement in all directions. So we'd already talked that they can herniate and press on the spinal cord or spinal nerves, and that can, definitely require surgery to repair for some people. And maybe even some of you students listening have already had these surgeries. So the rib cage is flexible because it does have cartilage on the front. So this is all cartilage right here. So the ribs attach to the sternum via these costal cartilages, which give the ribs their flexibility. So it allows us to breathe in and breathe out and expand those lungs without cracking ribs. So that's the costal cartilages that we find between the sternum and the ribs. If we look at the ribs, we can see we have 7 pairs of true ribs. And then we have 4 pairs of what we call false ribs, because they do not have a direct connection to the sternum. They kind of ride along with another rib. So therefore we call them false ribs. And then there's 2 ribs that have no connection to the sternum. They're just kind of hanging out there, so we call them floating ribs. So we have the true ribs, the false ribs, and the floating ribs. So again, the true ribs have a direct connection directly to the sternum, and they're not riding in on another set of cartilage. So like rib number 7 we can see has a direct connection, and then after that these ribs kind of have to ride in on the cartilage of rib number 7. So that's why we call them false ribs. We'll begin the next video with talking about articulations, where bones come together and move against one another.